Today is the start of the Superbet Rapid and Blitz in Poland, and we have some top players there. Magnus Carlsen, for example. And today we're going to cover one of his games. It has some surprises in it. Some are unexpected. His opponent is Radoslav Wojtaszek, who has the white pieces, and Magnus has black. Let's jump right in. Grandmaster Wojtaszek begins with d4, and we have our first surprise on move 1. Magnus Carlsen plays b5, or the Polish opening, probably, maybe because they're in Poland for this tournament, sort of an homage. But the idea, which looks odd, and is odd, is to indirectly control e4. So if a knight lands on c3, you can play b4 to remove it from the defense, bishop b7, playing for control of e4. So white plays e4 immediately. Magnus plays bishop to b7, willing to trade off his wing pawn for white's central pawn, so white doesn't do that. He plays bishop to d3, defending e4. Now knight to f6, continuing all of the pressure onto this e4 square. And here, knight to d2. Notice he avoids putting the knight on this square because he doesn't want it to get kicked with b4. So he plays knight to d2, continuing to protect the e4 pawn. Black plays c5, attacking the center. White would rather not take on c5. Then after knight to a6, the center, which was nice and well-placed, is now torn apart a little bit. So c3 is played. Now after pawn takes pawn, white can keep a full pawn center, which is what happens. Magnus takes on d4, Wojtaszek takes back on d4, and now he has this very nice e4, d4 pawn center. e6, looks like he wants to attack the center via the light squares, knight gf3, and knight to c6. And this is a novelty. Before a6 would be played, for example. But here, if white takes the pawn, then Magnus would play queen to b6, hitting the bishop and the d4 pawn. And after, say, bishop takes knight, queen takes knight, then he really has a lot of pressure on e4. And even though Magnus would be down a pawn, he actually would have a decent position here. So instead, Wojtaszek goes ahead and castles. Plays safe. I'm going to keep my nice center, and we'll move from there. And now Magnus does defend the b-pawn with a6. Rook to e1, just centralizing the rook, overprotecting the e4 pawn, placing the rook opposite the king. Bishop to e7, and now d5. A strong sacrificial idea from white, and Magnus is going to have a tough time dealing with this. This is a pawn sacrifice. White gets powerful play as a result of it. Pawn takes. Now you don't retake the pawn, but play e5, gaining space. And now this pawn on d5 is in some ways a problem for black. It blocks this b7 bishop, can become a target, and this square in front of the pawn is a nice landing space for white's knights. So this is a strong pawn sacrifice from Wojtaszek. Knight to h5, the knight could come into f4. Knight to b3. Now the bishop covers f4, but you see these knights arranging themselves where one might be placed on d4. And sort of taking advantage of some of these other dark squares as well. g6, and now bishop to h6. So black cannot castle because the bishop covers the f8 square. Black's best move here is probably bishop f8, but instead Magnus plays rook to g8. He wants to support this knight on h5's return into the game via g7, so he defends that with the rook. Bishop comes back to e3, now knight to g7, and knight to c5. Threatening perhaps to take this bishop on b7 and grab the bishop pair. If bishop c5, this would be a very poor move from black. White has too many squares controlled around Magnus's king. So he plays queen to c7, rook to c1, putting the rook opposite Magnus' queen, knight to e6, now knight to b7, queen b7, bishop to f1. So Wojtaszek is still down a pawn. But he has a two-bishop advantage. Magnus Carlsen's king is still stuck in the middle of the board, and if he can recover this d-pawn, white would just be dominating the position. Bishop to b4 from Magnus to irritate the rook on e1, which goes to e2, but that's not such a bad square for the rook. It can shift over to c2 and double on the open c-file. Knight to e7 to defend d5. Rook e to c2, so he does double on the c-file. Knight to f5, threatening to take the bishop on e3, messing up the pawn structure and removing the bishop pair, so you don't want that. Bishop to g5. Now, the knight can take the bishop here if he wants, but after knight to g5, white is doing really well. He's threatening to penetrate on c7 with the rooks. He's also threatening to take the pawn on h7 and then come back to f6 with check. Definitely not a good position, so you don't want to take that bishop. The bishop comes back to e7, and now Wojciech plays a really strong move. He plays bishop to f6, and in this case, he doesn't mind if Magnus takes the bishop, because the control of these dark squares, the lack of king safety, and white is completely dominating with this bone in the throat pawn on f6. So instead, Magnus plays knight f to g7. Now queen to d3. One strong idea was actually knight to g5, and after knight of h6, let's say, then knight e6, and white could play g3, bishop g2, place the bishop on that long diagonal, aiming at the d5 pawn, and he would be in very good shape in that position, although he's actually in decent shape now. Queen to d3. Bishop finally takes that bishop, ef6, and now knight to h5. He wants to keep this knight focused on this pawn. He'd love to grab that f6 pawn if at all possible. Queen to c3. Defends that pawn, but also threatens potential penetration down the c file, although it's hard to do it right now. Rook to d8, a3, queen to b8, and g3. Keeping a knight out of f4 and preparing the bishop to go to g2, which is sort of been angling at for a while now. g5, gaining space, and also perhaps the rook can activate itself here and on g6. Rook to e1, g4, with pinning the knight against the king, and now knight to d4, piling up on that knight on e6. The knight's defended twice at the moment, but it's very uncomfortable. Rook to g5, bishop to d3, not only aiming at this h7 pawn, but also potentially planting a knight on f5 or a bishop. That would really be difficult to deal with. Rook to e5, knight to f5, rook to e1 check, queen takes e1, knight takes f6. So Magnus has recovered that bone in the throat f6 pawn, but now that knight on f6 is undefended and his king is very exposed. Queen to b4, a very powerful move from Wojciech. It keeps that king from moving. He can't go to f8, or he can't get out of the center. Also, he's threatening a devastating check, knight to d6 check, which would force the king over to a discovery against the queen. So Magnus has to do something about that. He plays d6 to control this square, but that just further undermines the knight on e6. The queen goes back to c3. Now hitting that undefended knight on f6, Magnus moves the knight by playing knight to d7. Queen to h8 check from Wojciech, knight d to f8. Now queen to f6. Magnus is under threat of mate in 1. He has to do something about that, so he plays knight to g6 to cover that square. Rook to e2, pins this knight, creates all kinds of nasty threats. Queen to c7, and now knight to g7 check, an extremely powerful move here. If king to f8, the knight to e6 check forks the king and the queen, and the pawn can't take the knight because it is pinned. And if king to f8, king to d7, knight to e6, f e6, queen e6 check, king c6, then rook to c2 check. And that's that. When the king moves, rook takes c7. So in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigned. That's the second surprise of the game. He was not at his best. And in the post-game interview, he even said, "I haven't studied chess in a while." Well, it looks like that's apparent in this case. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.